All right, welcome to another deep dive. You know how this works. You send us the sources, the stuff you're really curious about, and we dive in.
That's right. We get to the heart of it, figure out what it all means and why it matters. And this time, the topic you've thrown our way is pretty intriguing: how students learn to argue effectively.
Yeah, learning to argue. I mean, it sounds simple enough,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But it's a lot more complex than you might think.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about winning a debate or shouting the loudest. There's a real art to constructing a solid argument, to thinking critically and using evidence effectively.
Exactly. And the sources you sent us this time, well, they take us right to the heart of that.
You shared some excerpts from a paper, an academic paper called Promoting Argumentation Competence, extending from first to second order scaffolding through adaptive fading. Catchy title, right?
Super catchy, yeah. But don't let that scare you off. This paper is packed with insights about how we can actually help students develop those core argumentation skills, the kind that go way beyond just winning a classroom debate.
Exactly. It's about making them strong arguers, period. Able to apply those skills in all sorts of situations, not just in one specific context.
Right, and I think we can all relate to this, right? Think back to your own school days. You probably had to do debates, class discussions, all that. But did those activities actually make you a better arguer in the long run?
That's the key part, Jen, isn't it? And that's exactly what this paper dives into. So where do we even begin?
Well, the paper starts by looking at how we currently support students when they're learning to argue. And right off the bat, it makes this really interesting distinction between something called first-order scaffolding and second-order scaffolding.
Okay, so scaffolding in education, it basically means the support we give learners, right? The guidance, the tools, the frameworks that help them as they're learning something new.
Exactly. And this paper argues that when it comes to argumentation, there's been a lot of focus on that first-order scaffolding.
Which is all about supporting students during a specific argumentative task.
Right. Think about those computer programs or online platforms designed to help students map out their arguments, respond to each other's points, and build a case collaboratively.
Yeah, those are great examples of first-order scaffolding. And the research shows that they can be really effective for that specific task, for helping students navigate that particular argument. But
The big question is, does that support actually translate into lasting skill development?
yeah, does it help them become better arguers in general, able to apply those skills to new situations, to think critically and argue effectively in different contexts? And that's where second-order scaffolding comes in.
And the paper argues that we actually don't have a great understanding of how to do that second-order scaffolding well. We don't really know if those first-order supports are actually translating into this deeper, more adaptable argumentation competence.
Yeah, and that's a huge insight, right? Helping someone win a specific argument isn't the same as teaching them how to be a strong arguer, period.
So how do we bridge that gap? How do we move from just supporting task completion to actually building that lasting competence? That's the challenge, and that's what this paper is trying to figure out.
All right, so to even begin tackling that, the authors introduced this really interesting concept: internal scripts.
Okay, internal scripts. What are we talking about here?
Imagine these as each learner's own internal playbook for how to approach argumentative situations. It's their own ingrained understanding of how arguments work, shaped by all their past experiences with disagreements, debates, discussions, all of that.
So it's like their default mode for how to navigate those situations. It's how they instinctively think about making their case, responding to challenges, and trying to persuade others.
Exactly. And to understand how external support, like those scaffolding tools we talked about, interacts with these internal scripts, the authors bring in a theoretical framework called the script theory of guidance, or STUG for short.
Stog. Okay, so what does this theory tell us about these internal scripts?
Well, STUG breaks these internal scripts down into different components, and this is where it gets maybe a little technical, but stick with me.
Okay, let's hear it.
So first, you have plays, which are the overall type of interaction. In this case, we're talking about collaborative argumentation, the act of arguing together with others.
All right, so that's the big picture, the overall context.
Right. Then, within those plays, you have scenes. These are the different stages or situations that happen within that interaction. So, for example, you might have a scene where you're presenting your initial argument, then a scene where you're responding to someone's challenge, and then maybe a scene where you're trying to find some common ground or reach a consensus.
Okay, so it breaks the argument down into these smaller chunks, these distinct moments where different things are happening.
Exactly. Now, within those scenes, you have roles. These are the different parts people might play within that specific scene. It could be as simple as speaker and listener, or it could be more specific, like proponent and opponent in a debate.
Right, who's doing what in that particular moment?
And finally, you have scriptlets. These are the specific actions or pieces of knowledge that someone needs to enact in a given scene. So, for example, if you're in a scene where you're defending your argument, a scriptlet might be knowing how to provide evidence to support your claim or knowing how to address a counterargument.
Okay, so it's the actual skills and knowledge they need to use in that specific part of the argument.
Precisely. And the key point from Stog, as the paper highlights, is this. Effective external support, any kind of scaffolding, needs to be aligned with or build upon those existing internal scripts.
Because if it doesn't connect with how the learner already understands argumentation, it might not be helpful.
It might even be harmful. There's this thing called the expertise reversal effect, where providing too much guidance can actually hinder learners who already have a decent grasp of the topic. It can actually create confusion and make it harder to learn.
It's like if you already know how to ride a bike and someone tries to give you all these detailed instructions on how to balance and pedal.
Exactly. You're like, I know how to do this. Just let me ride.
So knowing these internal scripts is essential for providing effective support.
Absolutely. And that leads us to the three-part guideline the authors propose for designing the second-order argument scaffolding.
Okay, so how do we actually put all of this into practice? What's the plan?
They suggest 3 steps. First, we have to figure out what that internal argumentative script is for each learner. We need to diagnose it.
All right, diagnosis.
Mm.
How do we do that? How do we get a sense of how a student naturally approaches argumentation?
Well, the paper looks at a bunch of different methods that researchers have used to try and do this. They've used performance tests, analyzed written arguments, asked students to identify good and bad arguments in sample dialogues, all sorts of things.
So it's like trying to get a baseline of their individual argumentation skills before they even start interacting with others.
Exactly. But the authors themselves point out a really important limitation here. They question whether assessing individual argumentation skills actually tells us what we need to know about how a student will argue in a collaborative setting. Because arguing with others, it's a dynamic process.
Right, it's not the same as constructing an argument on paper in isolation.
Exactly. How you argue when you're responding to someone, when you're trying to persuade a group, it might be totally different from how you argue when you're by yourself.
That makes sense. You might be great at writing a persuasive essay, but then struggle to think on your feet in a live debate.
So what's the solution? Well, the paper highlights the growing potential of using automated analysis to assess these internal scripts as students are actually arguing with each other.
Oh, interesting. So while they're in the middle of the discussion.
Exactly. Advances in AI and computer linguistics are giving us these powerful tools that can analyze how students argue in real time. They can look at the structure of their arguments, the types of reasoning they use, how they respond to each other's points, all sorts of things.
Wow, so the technology itself becomes an observer, tracking how they're actually engaging in that collaborative argumentation process.
Right. And the authors suggest we can use the framework of STOG to diagnose those internal scripts through this real-time analysis.
Okay, so we're looking for those plays, scenes, scriptlets, and roles within those interactions.
Exactly. Are they initiating the expected plays? Are their discussions moving through logical scenes? Are they using the necessary scriptlets, like providing evidence, addressing counterarguments, all of that? And are they taking on appropriate roles within the discussion?
So by analyzing all of that in the actual interactions, we can get a much clearer picture of their underlying approach to argumentation, how those internal scripts are actually playing out.
Exactly. The paper also mentions a couple of other methods that are more research-focused. Cued retrospective recall, where you basically have students think back on their thinking process during an argument, often by reviewing recordings or transcripts. And then there's expert modeling, where you study how experts in a field approach argumentation tasks.
But those sound like they're more for in-depth research, not something you'd easily use in a typical classroom.
Yeah, they're not super practical for everyday use.
Okay, so we've talked about how to understand these internal scripts, how to diagnose them. Now let's move on to that second step, providing adaptive external support.
Right. Once we have a sense of those internal scripts, how do we actually use that knowledge to support students effectively?
So adaptive means tailoring that support to what we've learned about how they naturally approach argumentation.
Precisely. The paper emphasizes that this support needs to be individualized. It needs to be customized for both individual students and for the group as a whole, taking those diagnosed internal scripts into account.
And they also make an interesting point about the different kinds of argumentative skills we might want to support.
Yeah, there's a difference between, say, teaching the general rules of good argumentation, things that are almost always important, like the need for evidence, and supporting those more specific context-dependent skills that might only come up in a particular type of argument.
Right, so you need to know the basic principles, but you also need to be able to adapt to the specifics of any given debate. So how do we actually do that? How can these feedback tools use that understanding of STOG, those plays, scenes, scriptlets, all of that, to provide that adaptive support?
Okay, so this is where it gets really practical. Imagine you have a feedback tool that's observing a student's argumentation in real time. And let's say this tool notices that a specific scriptlet, a particular action within the argument, is consistently missing when the student is trying to make their case.
Like what kind of scriptlet? Give me an example.
Sure. Let's say the student is making claims, but they're not providing evidence to back those claims up. Or maybe they're offering evidence but not explaining why that evidence supports their claim.
Right, that connection is super important.
It is. And in STOG terms, that connection is called a warrant. It's basically the reasoning that links your evidence to your claim.
Okay, so if a student is consistently missing that scriptlet, what does that tell us?
It might indicate that this is a genuine gap in their internal script. They might not understand the need for a warrant, or they might not know how to construct one.
So the feedback tool would need to provide more direct instruction in that case.
Exactly. The paper gives an example of what that feedback might look like. You've made a claim, but you haven't explained why your evidence supports it. That connection is called a warrant, and it's a crucial part of a strong argument.
Okay, so it's directly teaching them that missing piece.
Yeah.
But what if they do know how to do it, but they're just not doing it consistently?
Right. Maybe they get distracted or they forget in the heat of the moment. In that case, a simpler reminder might be more effective.
Something like, remember to connect your evidence to your claim. How can you strengthen your argument here?
Exactly. Just a little nudge to help them self-correct.
The paper also mentions the importance of positive feedback. So if a student is consistently making well-supported arguments, we should reinforce that.
Absolutely. A reminder that they're doing well can really strengthen that positive aspect of their internal script.
But how do we know if they genuinely don't know how to do something, or if they just chose not to do it in that particular instance? That seems tricky.
It is. The paper suggests looking at their performance over time. If they're repeatedly missing a particular scriptlet when it would be expected in a certain type of argument, then it's more likely that it's a genuine skill gap.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've diagnosed the internal script. We've provided tailored support. Now, what about that third step? Adaptive fading of that external support.
Right. This is all about gradually reducing that scaffolding as students become more competent, more independent arguers.
The goal is to help them internalize those skills so they don't need that constant external support.
Exactly. The paper emphasizes that internalization is a two-step process. First, they have to acquire the skill, and then they have to consolidate it, make it a solid part of their repertoire. And fading too early before they've really grasped it can be counterproductive.
Right, it's like taking the training wheels off before they can ride on their own. So how do we do this fading effectively?
Well, the paper looks at a bunch of different approaches that have been used in computer-supported collaborative learning environments. Some systems reduce support over time. Some do it based on the student's progress through different learning phases. Some do it based on the number of messages they've exchanged or hints they've used, all sorts of things.
And what have the results been like? Has fading been shown to be effective?
Honestly, it's a bit of a mixed bag. There's research that shows positive effects, research that shows no effects, and research where the findings are inconclusive.
So, no clear answer.
Not really. And the author suggests that maybe the reason for these mixed results is that fading on its own isn't enough. It needs to be aligned with those internal scripts and combined with other strategies.
Okay, so what are some of those other strategies? How can we make adaptive fading more effective?
Well, one approach they discuss is something called peer assessment fading.
So this is where students give each other feedback on their arguments. How does that tie into fading?
The idea is that by evaluating each other's arguments, students become more aware of the criteria for good argumentation. They start to internalize those standards. And as they get better at giving and receiving feedback, they become less reliant on direct teacher or system support.
Makes sense. You're essentially training them to be their own critics to evaluate their own arguments more effectively.
Exactly. Plus, there's a social element to peer assessment that can be really motivating. Students might be more receptive to feedback from their peers than from an authority figure.
But the paper also acknowledges some potential drawbacks to peer assessment.
Yeah. For one thing, it can be cognitively demanding. Asking students to analyze and critique each other's arguments requires a pretty high level of thinking.
And there might be social or emotional barriers too, right? Some students might be hesitant to criticize their classmates, or they might not take their peers' feedback seriously.
Right. And the paper suggests some ways to address these issues, like having multiple students rate each other's work or rotating the roles so everyone gets a chance to be both the giver and receiver of feedback.
Okay, what about other approaches?
Well, another one they discuss is using automatic response support tools to provide direct feedback.
So this is where technology comes back in.
Exactly. We talked earlier about how AI can be used to analyze arguments in real time. Well, some of these tools can also provide feedback based on that analysis.
So it's like having an AI argumentation coach that can point out unsupported claims, logical fallacies, things like that.
Exactly. And by providing that immediate objective feedback, these tools can address some of the limitations of peer assessment. There's no concern about the quality of the feedback or whether students will trust it.
Okay, that makes sense. What about that third approach they mentioned, the adaptable self-assessment fading?
Right. This one's all about giving students more control over the kind and amount of support they receive.
So they get to choose what kind of help they want and when they want it.
Basically, yeah. The idea is that this can promote self-regulated learning, where students are actively monitoring their own understanding and seeking out the support they need.
That sounds good in theory. But are students actually good at judging their own needs? I mean, wouldn't they just choose the easiest options?
That's a valid concern, and the authors acknowledge some of the potential downsides to giving students too much control. They might overestimate their abilities, or they might be overwhelmed by too many choices.
So it sounds like there needs to be a balance.
Exactly. And the paper suggests that students who have strong metacognitive skills, the ability to reflect on their own thinking, are more likely to benefit from adaptable self-assessment.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Definitely not. And the authors actually advocate for a combination of approaches using self-assessment alongside both direct feedback from those automated tools and indirect feedback from peer assessment.
Okay, so a multifaceted approach.
Right. And they also emphasize the importance of having clear criteria for good argumentation, like rubrics, so students know what they're aiming for when they're assessing their own work or the work of their peers.
All right, so let's try to bring all of this together. What are the key takeaways from this deep dive into argumentation competence?
Well, the biggest one is that we need to think beyond just helping students complete a specific argumentative task. We need to focus on building that deeper, more transferable ability to argue effectively in different situations.
That's second-order scaffolding.
Exactly. And to do that, we need to understand those internal scripts, those ingrained ways that students naturally approach argumentation.
And the authors propose this three-step process. Diagnose those internal scripts, provide tailored support, and then gradually fade that support as students become more competent.
Right. And that fading needs to be done strategically, in conjunction with other methods like peer assessment, automated feedback, and maybe even some self-assessment, all guided by clear standards.
So what does this all mean for educators and for learners themselves?
I think the big message is that learning to argue well is a complex process. It's not just about learning a set of rules or techniques. It's about developing a deeper understanding of how arguments work and how to apply those skills flexibly in different situations.
And by understanding these ideas, by paying attention to those internal scripts and providing the right kind of support, we can help students become truly competent arguers.
Exactly. It's about equipping them with the skills and knowledge they need to navigate the complexities of argumentation and to become effective communicators in all sorts of contexts.
This has been a fascinating deep dive.
Yeah.
And it really makes you wonder, how might this idea of internal scripts apply to other areas of learning?
Oh, I think it's relevant to all sorts of things.
Think about how you approach problem solving or decision making or learning a new skill.
Are there ingrained ways of thinking, those internal scripts that are either helping you or hindering you? It's definitely something to ponder.
Lots to think about. Thanks for diving deep with us.
My pleasure.